My topic for this presentation today is religion, scientific ecology, and environmental problem solving, and asking how much scientific ecology, and I'm going to distinguish that from some other forms of ecology, shares worldviews with what's happening on the religious side of things. Is there constructive cooperation, separation, or conflict? A critical concern from an environmental management or problem-solving point of view is when and how do religions make effective contributions? I realize Celia will criticize this as instrumental, but that's okay. It's about management. And when and how do religions constrain the process? It's important to understand that from a scientific perspective, the field of ecology does not equal environmental science. It's one of a number of scientific fields, including atmospheric physics, geology, some other areas of physics like thermodynamics that make contributions to environmental science. And it began as a life sciences field concerned with the biotic and with the theoretical as well as applied processes in ecology. It's very important to preserving biodiversity, dealing with carbon balances between the atmosphere and the rest of the planet, and dealing with disturbances of all types, including disturbances like wildfire. So it has a very critical scientific role to play. I'm going to make an observation which I cannot prove, but that is that religious academic analysis of environmental issues do not parallel scientific ecology or environmental science in terms of topical coverage and emphasis. The two things don't, if you go to the professional meetings from the two different sides, you're not seeing the same selection or exactly the same concerns. Now, this may be important or unimportant, but I'm just bringing it up here as a concern that I would have, and that religion often emphasizes climate, agriculture, and then lived-in environments as three of its bigger topics. It often provides less coverage of health, environmental health, and ecological contributions to health, conservation biology. Oceans often get left out of the picture, disturbance ecology, and so forth. That there are differences in how much time and effort is being put into some of these different subjects. So a first question, and one we really haven't asked as deeply as we should, is when religious scholars are exploring the field they call religion and ecology, do they mean scientific ecology or do they mean something else? And if so, are they engaging current ecological studies and theories? Are they trying to stay up to date? Are they really tackling this? Now, the term ecology began as scientific nomenclature like cytology or physiology, and it still has that meaning. The science of ecology includes a whole series of subfields. They proliferated after World War II like everything else in science. And there are applied fields such as forest ecology, fisheries ecology. Then we have something I call popular ecology. I don't think I've seen a book or a complete synopsis on this. It often has a commercial flavor, like ecology sandals, or it's about sustainable technology, and it often means eco, meaning environmental. It doesn't actually parallel the field coverage of scientific ecology. There is human ecology as expressed via the social sciences, particularly anthropology and sociology. And anthropologists are often pretty good at scientific ecology, as are environmental historians. Some of the folks involved from outside the sciences can do a very good job with that. There's civic ecology, which is public participation in environmental care, including citizen science. And more recently, we've had the growth of integral ecologies as cultural interactions with the environment. And there's some differences among different scholars as to what integral ecology means. So to start this off, I did a little survey. I decided I wasn't going to review the entire ecological literature, so I took a little shortcut. and took the Religion and Ecology series that was published by Harvard University Press beginning in the 1990s and then continuing to around, I think, 2007 or 8 or so, a 20-year project led by Mary Evelyn Tucker. The terminology religion and ecology was around before Mary Evelyn, but boy, did she give this some jet fuel, if you don't mind the analogy. And this was very, very influential in diversifying the religious context of the discussion. I think it did a lot of good. But what I've done here is looked at the fields represented, and sorry this is a little pale with the light, in some of the different volumes. I didn't have room for all of them: Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, and traditional Chinese religion, Islam, and traditional religions. There are some more, but this will make the point. And the purple here is a combination of philosophy, theology, religious studies, and ethics, as you usually see in a religious studies and philosophy department. The dark green, this bar, that bar, is somebody who's got a PhD in scientific ecology and is actually published in Science. It might not be their main field, but there they are. Light blue is the other sciences. And brown here is the professions. And this turned up some things I wasn't expecting. There's much more coverage of professions in Islam. It's actually the whole middle of the volume, and I'm with the Islamic scholars on this, that I think they're right to do that. And the professions count as law, medicine, architecture, landscape planning. In fact, they are the implementation force for most of the applications of scientific ecology and the other sciences that are involved in environmental management. The light green here is human ecology or related fields like anthropology and social science. Now, this does disclose some basic problems in the way Western religious studies looks at religion. This is mostly speaking for over here, and down here, when we look at traditional religion, it's mostly speaking about. Despite the fact that I think John Grimm, who led this project, did a good job of getting indigenous people and people who were practitioners of traditional religions included in that volume, many of whom are actually professionals here. So there are differences in approach among the religions. But something that's clear here is there aren't a heck of a lot of scientific ecologists in this. There were only 2 of us who would count in the Christian volume and 1 other scientist, myself, Calvin DeWitt, and Ian Barber, who's a physicist. And I didn't write on science. I was asked to respond to a paper, chapter on prophecy. And so I wrote a response on eco-deacons. So this is not really the scientific voice. It's largely missing from this project, and at least ecology is, and science in general. And another thing that turned up here is there barely was an economist in the scene. Both ecology and economics are really not represented here with people who've got full-scale expertise in them. Well, that was circa 20 years ago. What about some of the more recent work on integral ecology? Is there more or less science in this? So I'm looking just at 2 volumes here, one of which Sam Mickey I happen to have sitting on my shelf. Sam Mickey, Sean Kelly, and Adam Roberts, which was published in 2017, Variety of Integral Ecologies, which is more or less a general, not a specific religion academic take. And then a volume by O'Hara, Eaton, and Ross, which is specifically addresses Laudato Si. In the case of the O'Hara volume, there's 1 scientist represented, I think, who's from the Vatican Observatory, who's really more interested in cosmology. It's pretty similar to the Christian representation in the previous draft. Mickey et al. Include a lot more social scientists in their volume. It's really social science meets metaphysics in the approach they take. But you can see that this is still not, it's really not addressing the scientific side in terms of the participants. Now, these 2 interpretations of integral ecology are not the same. If you look at this volume by O'Hara et al. That's mostly Roman Catholic, it's much more interested in strategies for development. It has more case histories in it. It has more direct ethical conversation, and there is a clear interest in disparities and the political economics to a greater extent than in Mickey, who are more interested in different humanities fields and the way they're interacting environmentally. Am I making sense to everybody about this? So the scientists aren't showing up for these projects, and that leads to an interesting question about what the term ecology means. I'm going to apologize to anyone here who has graduate education in ecology, including you anthropologists and geographers, and I'm sure being stuck in a course or two. But let's go back, and I want to do a brief review of the history of scientific ecology during the same period that religion and ecology is developing as an academic field, kind of through the second half of the 20th century, very speedy. Incidentally, I tend to speak pretty fast, so wave at me if I'm going too quickly. The term was coined by Ernst Haeckel, a German naturalist, zoologist, artist, and a founder of the Monist Society, giving him a very specific philosophical and theological view. Comes from a Greek word meaning household. It's the same root as the word economics. He was an enthusiastic Darwinian, and like his generation, he did idealize humans at the top of the evolutionary tree. Let me point out here that this is his art in the corner. The projection doesn't do it justice. He's actually in a dialogue with the development of modernity in art, with what's going to happen in 20th century art for a late 19th century figure. If you look at the way ecology developed in the early 20th century, and I'll just give you an American example, one of the primary themes was succession after disturbance or on new ground, like a volcanic lava field. And Frederick Clements was a leader of the pack in this, and he saw succession as a deterministic process, leading to an idealized outcome called the climax. Little 19th century prejudice in that. They treated ecological communities as bounded by ecotones, and Clements viewed the community as a superorganism, a bunch of plants and animals that had evolved together. They had almost become a working unit. This is a very bounded, very deterministic view of outcomes in nature. There's an important period of transition around World War II. In the early 1940s, a paper by Raymond Lindemann was published, The Trophic Dynamic Aspect of Ecology, which frames ecosystems in terms of energy transfer and nutrient cycling. This is really a breakaway. R.H. Whitaker and Henry Gleason advocated for an individualistic theory, and think about Western philosophy when I'm saying this, for an individualistic view of species, that they acted individually along gradients like moisture or elevation or soil depth. And Whitaker was really a founder of the gradient theory of species distribution. Eugene Odum published a text in 1953 that was in press for several decades after that, where he tried to take a holistic approach concerning ecosystems, saw them as formed from interacting biotic communities, and he made an effort to constrain reductionism in the scientific approach to these biotic phenomena. This is from Whitaker's paper in Great Smokies. The well-defined boxes here are gone. This is a distribution of individual species along a moisture gradient, and you'll notice that they all have their own optima. This is not a community working as some kind of evolved unit like a cell in a plant. So from the 1960s into the 2000s, what is ecology up to? It's up to systems. Systems everything. There's an attempt to move from descriptions to experimentation or comparisons among systems with major variables controlled. They're trying to get rid of the old natural history descriptiveness and make it more like, there were talks in the ecological community about physics envy, that they really needed to fix it and add more math, and they did. They applied math, they added a lot of statistical testing, the model shifted from deterministic to stochastic. by the 1980s, there was a major move to try and deal with chance in Earth processes. There was an increased emphasis and a lot of funding for development of predictive models, which many of you now see as these models of carbon and climate change. Models that would be dependable, that would tell you what would happen if you change something in the environment, you changed what was operating on the environment. There was an internationalization of the comparisons. The International Biological Program in the 1960s would compare grassland biomass in Poland, UK chalk grasslands, and a prairie in the United States, and look at the rate of carbon sequestration in those systems in different countries. Very important to my other topics for today is there was an expansion of scales. Clements was locked up in human scales, meters and farm fields, and in lifespans of plants and people, maybe a few centuries at the most. By the time you're rolling into the 1980s, they're studying microbes in the ocean. They're moving from microcosms and sandbox experiments to landscape ecology and global carbon modeling. This is a very recognized trend. They're also expanding the scales in terms of time from microseconds to deep time. And there's an increased emphasis on the ecology in the paleontological sense. During the late 20th century, there's a conscious exploration of hierarchy, connectivity between system elements and processes, flows, pathways, linkages, and interspecific relationships. So some of the outcomes of this are projects like Hubbard Brook, where they did controlled logging and herbicide application. They'd log one small watershed, then they'd have a control watershed, and they'd track where all that carbon and nitrogen went, into the air, into the water. And then the other side of it is the Gaia hypothesis. Lynn Margulis links microbial ecology and the biochemistry of photosynthesis with the atmospheric physics of James Lovelock. And I'm not going to referee who's responsible for what in this particular juncture. Other scientists began to carry this into deep time. And so all the work on carbon sequestration and cycling converges into this big question about what's happening with the change of atmospheric chemistry due to greenhouse gases. Not just to carbon per se, but not just to carbon dioxide, but also to methane. So from the 1960s into the early 2000s, you've got an abandonment of models of old strongly bounded systems and processes. Disturbance is perceived now as producing positive outcomes. It's not something you're always fighting, like fire is always bad, but it may increase biodiversity, or it may increase your productivity. And the outcomes of disturbance processes are seen as producing multiple stable states. When Stuart Pickett and Peter White in the 1980s consolidated a set of papers, a very good set of papers on disturbance theory at that time, and I got the book and looked at it, the first thing that struck me about it is how postmodern it was in the way they were beginning to deal with this. There's a tuning down here, this is important to religion, of the notion of the harmony of nature. Despite the fact that Gaia is dancing goddesses, that's not really what's happening in scientific ecology. They're not expecting this to be quite that smooth and the fairy dust to work quite as effectively. The concept of virgin ecosystems, for another 19th century term, kind of goes by the board as everyone realizes that all this supposedly untrammeled wilderness in the eastern US is actually being burned by Native Americans repeatedly in previous centuries. And there's a conscious attempt to drop idealistic assumptions and dichotomies resulting from culturally rooted categorizations, which is one of the things that had really kept ecology bound up in some of the wrong predictive stances during the era of Clements. There also is a lot of investigation, as sort of a self-exploration of disasters caused by scientific advice, like the collapse of the Peruvian anchovy fisheries, the removal of predators from the Kaibab Plateau and the Grand Canyon region, and fire suppression, which was starting to cause more and more intense and uncontrollable wildfires, and also at the same time endangering communities like the giant sequoias, which can't reproduce without fire. So this is coming in, and conservation biology is partially a reaction to fields like wildlife management and forest ecology that are very driven by industry or by extraction, like hunting, and trying to correct some of the mistakes that had been made by science not predicting how systems were going to respond. Now, does religion and ecology dialogue with or parallel these trends in scientific ecology, or are the topics and emphases more similar to popular ecology? And I am going to claim here, especially considering the lack of scientific representation in some of these projects, that there has been a lot of leaning towards popular ecology, and that might be one of the reasons that some of the topics have been constricted or don't parallel exactly what the scientists are talking about. I'll just throw that out as an idea. But defining popular ecology is tough. So I did a little experiment by putting the word ecology into a Microsoft stock collection and seeing what Microsoft thought ecology was, figuring this probably paralleled the public view to some extent. And Microsoft thinks it's one planet, some form of green holism, almost always done in green, or sustainable technology, or some other interaction they really interpreted environmentally. Doing this with Bing was even more entertaining because they were entirely into holism. And I think the planet made of euros kind of summarizes the Bing approach. This is a little bit more what scientific ecology has been looking at lately. It's dealing with scale at different levels, and is interested in interactions among species and cycling and systems and the health of ecosystems like coral reefs. Well, I think we could genuinely say that religion has had a tendency to appropriate the term ecology, and has been leaning towards popular usage, but is this actually problematic? There's some advantages in addressing the issues that are on the public's mind, or addressing the environment much the way people in a congregation or a temple would address it. And I'm not convinced that it's entirely evil. I think the problem with it is that it's limited, that it inhibits dialogue concerning current ecological theory, and it short circuits ethical dialogue of a host of concerns centered on living systems. You don't get enough discussion of coral reefs and ocean acidification when you tend to follow the popular track. We don't experience conflict over this, so I think we don't react to it. It's not like the battling over Darwinism. Now, can religion harm or disregard scientific ecology? And we've already talked about conservative viewpoints, and I'll just remind you of these. Conservative Christians and fundamentalists from a number of religious traditions, I'd put Islam and Hinduism in this category occasionally too, can reject scientific concepts, especially if they're predicting disaster or degradation. There can be rejection because science appears to be superseding divine authority. It's a very common problem. Sometimes scientists are portrayed as secular, self-motivated, and untrustworthy, racked with conflict of interest, not acting in public welfare, just trying to get more grants. At least conservative Christianity often favors wealth-oriented and neoliberal economic models. It may see ethical correctives environmentally as damaging individual economic interests and control. And as we all know, and we were talking about when I first arrived at the meeting in a heated discussion over one of the picnic tables, with some conservative Christians cheering, or maybe a lot of conservative Christians cheering, the Trump administration has been annihilating environmental grant support and countering best scientific advice over a whole host of environmental issues, and has been trying to reduce the regulatory role of environmental concerns. The impact is also on environmental health research, despite the direct human applications of that and the concern for child welfare that environmental health research often forwards. And I'm only going to show one more slide on Trump. I think we'll leave that as my remaining comment on what's been happening in American science. But let's go over to the liberal side. For one thing, it might be easier to change their thinking if they're on the wrong track. But religion and ecology or integral ecology couldn't harm scientific ecology or disregard it, could they? So I'm just going to look at the Mickey book. I'm not going to approach the Roman Catholic end of this because I think it's somewhat different, and several people here are very skilled in that area and they're going to present on it. But Mickey and his co-authors in their introduction define ecology as you usually would and say that although this definition is correct, it does not tell the whole story. And they, of course, want to add a cultural element to this in efforts to deeply understand and creatively respond to complex matters, meanings, and mysteries of relationships that constitute the whole of the Earth community, note the scale on which they're operating, which is probably not the approach that scientific ecology would take. The aim of this book is not to present a comprehensive account of ecology. I think they do mean scientific here, much of which has already been written. They're actually portraying the science end of this as relatively static and something definite that they think they're going to work with. They think they're going to be able to facilitate collaboration and communication amid a full spectrum of ecologies. This is a major shift in the meaning of the word because it's very, very culturally framed. Now, they do something interesting in their introduction, which is they use two ecologists as proxies for the whole field of ecology. And one of them is Ernst Haeckel, our 19th century artist and monist, and the other is Eugene Odum, of all people, who among ecologists from his time period was one of the least embattled in theoretical fights and so forth. He was a very fine wetland ecologist and did a bunch of studies on communities like salt marshes that were absolutely excellent academic work. But the critique of Haeckel here is that what he's proposing, the ecology is proposing, was only able to account for ecological phenomena mechanistically. Anything that has to do with the divine or transcendent agency is considered unscientific. Of course it is. This isn't a problem of ecology. This is a problem of all of science. This is not specific to ecology. And they note that Haeckel's pantheism is a mechanistic materialism. I don't think they're miscalling Haeckel, but I'm not sure that this should be deciding how we're going to interact with contemporary ecology and environmental problem solving. They also mention Haeckel's contributions to social Darwinism and to Nazi ideology. That's all true, but I don't think very many contemporary ecologists would agree with that in any way. That's putting it pretty far in the past. More interesting than sort of dissing Haeckel is they accuse Gene Odum's integrative approach to ecology and his efforts to overcome reductionism as inadequate. And Odum was really a founder of the field of environmental studies. He was very highly interdisciplinary in his approach. They critique Odum because he does not address the spiritual or religious dimensions of ecology at all. I think he had trouble fitting them into his salt marsh studies, but maybe if he'd taken a couple more classes in poetry, he would have figured out a way to do it. And accuse him of not including the humanities within his holistic thinking. One could describe Odum's holistic ecology as crypto-reductionistic. And since Gene Odum's office was down the hall from mine when I was at the Institute of Ecology, and I also knew people like Frank Golly, they spent a lot of time worrying about the fact that they were still being reductionistic. It wasn't that they weren't concerned about this, but I want to put in a correction over Gene Odum, and it's to look at the way this critique is being done too, that Odum acknowledged that his own scientific thinking had been strongly influenced by social science. And his father, who was an early version of a sociologist who was teaching at one of the North Carolina universities. He'd grown up in a social science household. Odum welcomed interdisciplinarity at the Institute of Ecology at the University of Georgia, which he founded. And he campaigned to have the environmental ethics program, which has become a leading program in that area and has included both religion and philosophy, established at Georgia. It was very strongly supported by the Institute, and many of the early meetings and presentations of that program were held at the Institute of Ecology at the scientific facility. And I can't remember which ones Gene Odum attended, but he came to humanities and social sciences talks frequently. And speakers during the Odum era included people like Holmes Ralston and Carolyn Merchant. We had great speaker series. And I don't know where they got the money, but I think Odum helped with that too. And I was welcome to speak on eco-theology, monasticism, and wilderness spirituality. And there was some cynicism from the science side, but I don't remember Gene Odum as being guilty of that, despite the fact that he was not a religious man. He was too interested in what causes people to interact with the environment or with ecological phenomena the way they do. Mickey then criticized Odum for not including enough humanities and not doing what's necessary to bring together the humanities with the fine arts. The Odum's Institute, although I think his wife had something to do with this, was designed with display space, and we frequently hosted art shows with receptions and public presentations open to the entire university. That was also considered appropriate to the scientific environment. Now, integral ecology has had some other concerns here. One of them is that scientific ecology has, despite the interdisciplinarity of standard Gaia theory and Earth system science, has followed the dominant trend in late modern science towards increasing specialization and disciplinary fragmentation. Sean Kelly in his chapter says that the science of ecology, for their part, are generally following the dominant trend. Kelly also critiques ecology as part of the disenchantment or Entzauberung of the world. Again, this is a problem of science and not of ecology specifically, as is the materialism and the mechanistic portions of this. And Kelly proposes 5 principles for integrative ecology: evolutionary, planetary, transdisciplinary, re-enchanted, and engaged. But I'm going to ask the question here if scientific ecology is really souring the soup. Is it causing any problems that we need to be concerned about? They're, of course, going to try to get rid of the dualisms, which early ecologists were also trying to do. But in one of the chapters in the Mickey et al. Book, they divide academic fields into 4 boxes. Interior individual I, exterior individual it, interior collective we, and exterior collective its. This is a little simplistic. I shouldn't have put them in green. But interestingly enough, in the exterior individual it's the train of behavior. It's the train of behaviors. But this includes chemical ecology, molecular ecology, mathematical ecology, environmental psychology, and restoration ecology. And I have absolutely no idea why this is being organized this way or even perceived this way, that this is it. It's inadequate because it's not we. So I'd like to quickly move on here to look at one of these fields, ecological restoration, and look at religion interacting with the scientific professionals in some applied cases from this field. And William Jordan III, the author of The Sunflower Forest, and I, and a burn boss from the Illinois County Parks, Tom Simpson, recently completed a book chapter, and anyone, it's still in press, but anyone who'd like a copy, I can provide you one, entitled Night Burn on the Prairie, Ecological Restoration as Performance, Ritual, and Ceremony. That is, we looked at the religious aspects of this, including in civic religion. And restoration is the attempt, as Bill Jordan has written, sometimes spectacularly successful, sometimes less so, to make nature whole. That is, to return it to some previous historic state. And this may be natural. It could be an alpine meadow that has had very little human interference but is being degraded by hikers. Or it could be an English chalk grassland where the sheep have been removed and some rare and endangered species have suddenly disappeared. It can be from either source. And I want to introduce one more comment here. This is Peter Sherwood White. This is the White of White and Pickett. And he's been corresponding with me over whether the Aldo Leopold land ethic accommodates the recent ecological views of landscapes. And most of the language probably does not. And the patches, the matrices, the scales, the variable disturbances. And he's been asking, can we develop a version of land ethic with the range of scales and varying outcomes that ecology is studying? And I've been mentioning a term called eco-dimensionality, which I sort of coined to accommodate the fact that often when a religion is effective in assisting with the management of natural resources or in regional conservation, that it has well-developed eco-dimensionality in space and time. It has biotic inventories. Traditional and regional religions often retain detailed spatial and locative maps and protect keystone resources and natural processes. And religious symbolism, sacred stories, and so forth are often used to do this. And I don't want to consider this just something that's in traditional or indigenous religions. I think that's the fault of academic prejudices in how we study things. But Islamic gardening and landscape design is just rich with eco-dimensionality and consideration of microclimates and shade and spatial alignments. Valley water temple systems, same thing. Tremendously able to deal with change in space and time. So let's go to restoration. And let's look at it not as a religious event, but as public spiritual practice, potentially. Professionals or scientists often organize restoration events, such as burns held in prairies, maybe every third year, to get rid of woody invaders, to keep nutrients cycled and so forth, to encourage seeding. And in the Midwest of the US, at least, burns have become a rite of spring, eagerly anticipated by growing numbers of prairie people who hold fire festivals and picnics and come out to help and participate. And whether the scientists want to or not, they have become ceremonies and rituals. And then there's the question about whether the burn itself is, which leads to the question of whether are the fire and biota actors in the performance? Are they celebrants when you're restoring the prairie? Gretel van Weeren has looked at this in its civic religions context and reports that humans are in important ways restored to the land, and the reconnection through the experience of participating in restoration is effective in a spiritual and moral sense. There's quantitative social science data on this too, including for adolescents. Restoration performs sacred work and serves as a form of public witness. It can engender spiritual moral experiences within the human participants. Now, to look at this a different way, if you have communities, religious communities, congregations, or in this case, a monastic community practicing restoration, they often adapt it to their religious values. It can be a very good fit. And we're talking scientific ecology, restoration ecology now. The Benedictine Sisters of Holy Wisdom Monastery, which is overlooking Lake Mendota in Wisconsin, which is the site of the Arboretum where Bill Jordan worked for a couple of decades as an educator. But their spirituality, their sacramentality is based on the balance of the day, where the hours mark intervals for labor and study, leisure, community worship. And through these practices, the community becomes more aware of God's presence in ordinary activities and in the larger world. Now, restoration is relatively demanding work, but the sisters have been able to fit it in. They've restored prairies and woodlands on their property. They have no trouble with getting scientific help and consulting. And the nature trails they put in to reach their prairies and their new populations of songbirds serve as outdoor laboratories for local school children. People can come and enjoy them for prayer. And they're just welcoming sites for a time to renew and enlighten inner spirits. Restoration and sacramentality can fit in public projects as well. According to the nuns, it can awaken individuals to the non-human beings in their midst, as well as to the divine presence in creation. And this is my photography of a civic restoration project in Waco, Texas, which, if you visit it, there are families there with kids just hanging out. You will see people just sitting quietly. It's used as a site for refreshment and renewal within the local community. The second point I'd like to make about this is when you read about the sisters in this case, some of the reports on it that consider this integral ecology miss the fact that there was a huge scientific support matrix around the sisters when they got started in this. If they had anything to do with children's education, they probably knew about the prairie and woodland restorations at the Arboretum and about the work that was going on there. So this is in a greater matrix of science. There are a lot of civic organizations participating, individual landholders. This is much more about something that's happening on a community basis. And just to grouch at Mickey et al. Over their view of aesthetics, this is a page from one of my recent page from one of my field notebooks, and my photograph of a swift setwing. And this is my photography of dragonflies and damselflies from a place called Walnut Creek. And I don't work on these. I just like to go out and enjoy them and appreciate the interactions on the sites. And many, especially field ecologists, are far better photographers than I am. It might be craft rather than fine art, but I think you'll find that this is very integrated into the scientific lifestyle. As a second example here of ecological restoration, I'd like to look at traditional and indigenous religion, which is more what we more often think of, and their take on cultural fire. And the Waccamaw-Siouan and Lumbee tribes of eastern North Carolina have historically considered themselves to be people of the pines and the savannas of the longleaf pine. Now, there's much recent scientific interest in the longleaf because it's disappearing. And so are the savannas, with a lot of rare and endemic species on them. And they're also very important to some types of wildlife, like tortoises. And so there's a convergence here of the interests of the two groups. The longleaf has long been sacralized. It's being used to build buildings, palisades, make log canoes. The seeds are edible. You can make a tea out of leaves. It's got great long needles, which are wonderful for making baskets. And more recently, women from some of the Native American groups have taken the spiral pine symbol and used it in designs on dresses to attend events like powwows and other community gatherings. So it's part of attire for essentially sacred events. Longleaf requires fire to reproduce and to grow. And the other side of this, though, is the role of fire in the traditional religions. And fire was used historically to clear farm fields, to open areas to encourage grasses and the formation of proteins in grasses to support wildlife for harvest. And it was used to maintain and purify ritual spaces such as council fire areas, dance grounds, and the fields for sacred games, which include stickball. And this was all ritualized. The stargazing fields of the Lumbee would have been cleared by fire, and the Milky Way is a critical element in their cosmology. We tend to want to limit the space on this and not see it in its larger ecological dynamic. I recently attended an Inuit fire lighting, household fire lighting ceremony, where the young man who was conducting the ceremony used hair pellets and dried seaweed to start the fire in a hand-carved soapstone dish that he had carved himself. And we want to see it in that space. But if you look at it in, say, the case of the Native American groups from the Eastern and the Western US, this is the Green Corn Dance. This is 19th century illustration by George Catlin, where there is a sacred fire, but you have to see the dance ground itself is ritually cleared by fire. And the ball fields were huge. And if you look at this illustration, the hills behind have also been burned, probably partially by natural fire and partially by anthropogenic or cultural fire, probably to maintain conditions for herds of game. There is a ritual before stickball involving fire for purification. The thunders play stickball. That's all the noise they're making. The sky beings do, and so do the animals. And the bears don't always win. Sometimes the birds and the bats win instead. And share thought. So could scientific ecology harm religion? Kelly's concerns about de-enchantment are certainly valid, but scientific ecology has often rejected traditional ecological knowledge when it was more than correct. This has happened repeatedly. And in the longleaf case, scientific forestry for the longest time, supported the complete wildfire suppression, supported regulating and fining anybody who set any fires in the forest, both white farmers and the Native American nations. You just couldn't do the burning. You could, in some cases, clear a stickball field. You could even get your land back to play stickball. This led to decimating the longleaf savannas. And I'm going to quote from Collenbaugh and Hagen, who report for the Cherokee. Cherokee cultural burning likely had deep-rooted symbolic importance in 20th century fire exclusion policies banning certain burning practices, flouted Cherokee rights through direct interference and significant landscape level change. Fire suppression directly impacted the religious practices and the religious landscape, with, for the longest time, no complaints being made about this. On the happier side here, the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Nature Conservancy, and North Carolina Botanical Garden and others, wildfire professionals, have been cooperating with the Lumbee and the Waccamaw in reestablishing longleaf pine on tribal lands. And the Waccamaw and the Lumbee have been participating on the Nature Conservancy preserves. So they learn the techniques, they learn the plants, they get the methods. Meanwhile, and the Nature Conservancy has been providing seedlings. They found a large tree for making a log canoe when the Native American groups didn't have a big enough one to bring it off. And they've helped the nations organize their own culture, prescribed burning crews, which is working in tandem to recruit more volunteer firefighters for their communities, which they also need for their household safety. And the Waccamaw hold all of this, the restoration of the longleaf, as a means of clearing industrial contaminants from the soils, and therefore by healing the land and the community. Think of the religion here as a landscape matrix, conserving a huge amount of ecological information within all those rituals and all those practices as a means of maintaining TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. And the Native American groups are benefiting by the reestablishment of cultural fire. They're reasserting their sovereignty. They're recovering landscapes, cultural meaning, and cultural identity. And I just want to mention, because I've been talking about fire so much due to having just worked with Tom Simpson, that some restoration projects don't involve it. One that is another recent, has had a lot of successful contact between science and traditional religion, has been restoration of sacred fish ponds in Hawaii. They were used for food. Historically, they would have religious sculptures on either end and a whole set of rituals involved in their maintenance and their harvest. There have been a series of lawsuits over this, but mostly over who actually controls the pond. Native Hawaiians and the Park Service have sued back and forth over the pond in the picture here, which is often a source of dissonance. So let's look at putting this all together. There's not a specific cosmology that's better for restoration ecology. Communitas is the key. There's generally acceptance of ecological science and good communication over it if the goals of the scientists or the Nature Conservancy and the religious communities are shared, if they're largely on the same page over why they're doing this. Everybody values the dynamic, engaged knowledge gleaned from the restoration. The generation of ritual elements, of community events, and that kind of thing helps to establish this in a long-term context. And again, the different cosmologies generally sacralize the land, the biota, the work, the human activity, the uses for the sites or for the biota, and the ecological processes. They do all those things together. Now, I have a lot of trouble at seeing this as it, exterior and individual, and it may be the way I relate to the plants involved, but I almost can't categorize it that way. It's just simply too communitarian in all directions to do something like this and come out with just carpets of wildflowers when you're finished, and a lot of biodiversity. Scientific ecology, religion, and TEK act synergistically when the professionals in the community share goals and value nature in similar ways. All the parties are respectful of the cultural and economic interests of the others. The Nature Conservancy is quite good at this, and they work to build understanding. And the professionals share the decision-making, incorporate TEK, and the engaged knowledge the communities acquire. If you shift control to the communities, they'll often participate more enthusiastically. And it's important here to allow the spirituality, the aesthetics, the citizen science, the picnics, the celebrations to emerge and become part of the process. Traditional ecological knowledge, knowledge that's not coming from science, sorry about that. But it's often conveyed by religious symbolism or religious stories, including art. Moral stories, say about the survival of salmon coming up rivers, would contain TEK. I don't think academic bifurcation works very well here. Nature religion, not nature religion. I'd really hate to throw the Benedictine sisters against the Wakamatsu basket weavers in some kind of contest. If it's stickball, the Sioux might win, but if it's flag football, I think the Benedictines could probably pick it up pretty fast and do pretty well. The science in this, and now some people here might argue with me, is and will remain mechanistic. That's its tool set and the way it acquires and interprets knowledge. However, many ecologists are driven by spiritual relationships and their aesthetic passions, especially in fields like restoration ecology and conservation biology. Scientific knowledge is often sufficient to guide ecological restoration, but it's just as often insufficient to glean the necessary public support and entrench the restoration into the landscape matrix and into community process and values. And I think I'm just going to take a minute or two with this and not go through it very fast. I think or not go through it in detail. I think there are a lot of places here where we could be holding some discussions on some topics we don't always approach. One of the observations from this, if you look at the conservatives and the liberals, they have some of the same problems. They're bothered by the same thing, that the science is superseding or ignoring the divine, or it's superseding individual decision-making and expression or economic interests. There's a lot of concern coming every different way over scientific conflict of interest. Robert Kennedy Jr. just accused his vaccine committees, the old vaccine committees, of being engaged in conflict of interest. With no evidence for this, nothing, it's just sort of, you're evil, get out of here, I'm appointing people who don't think like you do. But this is a point where we could be having further discussions. I realize that conflict of interest has become a criterion for getting on the US Supreme Court, but I think the science group can recognize it as problematic. There's a lot of complaining that science is unresponsive to sociocultural contexts. And one of the things that makes that restoration work is the Nature Conservancy being willing to try and work with those and trying to take groups by what they think is important. And if it's pine seeds to eat or make baskets, that's important to the Nature Conservancy, and they're willing to make trades and share information. In fact, conflict of interest would make a great topic for discussion on a mixed conservative center liberal dialogue with some science people to talk about this in ecology and the environment. And another thing that I'm going to suggest here is examining some of the dissonance in between the religion and ecology and the science and ecology, the topical coverage. Where's the divergence? Why is it there? And I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. Anyone ready to prove me wrong? What are the ethical implications of this? It may be unimportant. Maybe it's better to put every chip you have into dealing with climate change. Maybe that's what we should be doing, just focusing on one thing, really working on it, trying to turn the tide, trying to get more practical solutions. There are differences in language and communication styles. And back to scale and process, if we return to Peter White's question about the land ethic, I think the same thing applies to religious responses concerning that. This business of matrices, small patches, large patches, people managing their land in different ways, some boundaries being permeable, other boundaries being impermeable, is very important to managing entire landscapes, as you're seeing in the longleaf case, where you have many cooperating stakeholders. And I think in religious terms, we relatively rarely address this. We tend to flip from local scales or household scales to global scales and don't work so much in the middle. And so it would be interesting to investigate perceptions that might involve individual questions like that. And I was going to talk about the problem of using sacred scriptures for dealing with landscape scales, but I think I better stop.